there's something unsettling that almost nobody notices. Every day, without realizing it, you might be losing the respect of others. Not because of a big mistake, not because of a heated argument, but because of small behaviors you repeat without thinking. Why do some people stop taking you seriously? Why does the attitude change even if no one says anything? And there's an even more important detail that often goes unnoticed. Stick around because understanding it can completely change how others see you. There's an everyday attitude that seems harmless but immediately erodes respect. Interrupting others with an "I already know," "I already get it," or "you don't need to explain." It's not always said with bad intentions, but the message it sends is clear. The other person feels their contribution doesn't matter, that their viewpoint is expendable, and that talking to you is unnecessary. When someone cuts an explanation short before it finishes, they're not showing intelligence, but impatience and a need for control. Deep down, it communicates that listening is a waste of time. This triggers a silent reaction in the other person. They stop sharing, reduce their involvement, and little by little, withdraw their respect. An open confrontation isn't necessary. The distancing happens internally. Psychology describes this pattern through the Dunning-Kruger effect. People with less understanding often overestimate their knowledge, while those who truly know more tend to ask questions, listen, and doubt. Curiosity, not certainty, is what generates authority. When someone shows openness, invites dialogue, and acknowledges there's always something new to learn, they convey real confidence. Conversely, the "I know-it-all" attitude stems from insecurity. It's a defense to avoid being exposed, to avoid showing ignorance, but the price is high. Someone who adopts this attitude might gain a false sense of superiority, but they lose something much more valuable: the trust and respect of others. Over time, people stop sharing ideas with you, not because they don't have any, but because they feel they won't be heard. And when someone stops listening to you internally, respect has already gone. This is just the first behavior, but it's not the only one. There's another equally common attitude that also silently erodes respect. There's another everyday attitude that, without raising one's voice or causing conflict, gradually erodes respect, constantly playing the victim. It's that way of speaking where everything seems to go wrong, where circumstances are always unfair, and problems are never one's own fault. It's not about denying real difficulties, but about the permanent stance from which they're approached. When someone repeatedly presents themselves as someone to whom everything happens, the implicit message is that they have no control over their own life. At first, others show understanding. They listen, support, try to help. But over time, something changes. The constant repetition of complaints starts to generate emotional fatigue. The person stops being seen as strong and begins to be perceived as trapped in their own narrative. There's a clear difference between acknowledging a problem and building one's identity around it. Recognizing a difficulty is human. Turning it into a constant narrative is a choice. People usually respect those who, even in complicated situations, take responsibility and seek solutions. The sense of agency, of internal control, generates silent admiration. Conversely, victim energy conveys dependence. It suggests that things can only change if the environment is modified, if others act, or if luck appears. This reduces the perception of personal strength. Without anyone openly saying it, others begin to distance themselves. Not out of a lack of empathy, but out of exhaustion. Respect isn't lost all at once, it dilutes. It slips away in every conversation where complaining replaces action, where lament replaces responsibility. And when that happens, people stop seeing you as someone capable of standing on their own. But this isn't the only silent way to lose respect. There's another, even more subtle attitude that often goes unnoticed, because it masquerades as confidence. And that's precisely why it's so dangerous. There's a form of arrogance that's rarely recognized as such, because it's not expressed with shouts or open disdain. It's subtle arrogance. It appears when someone turns any conversation into an opportunity to talk about themselves, to show that they know more, have lived more, or understand things better. It often masquerades as well-intentioned advice or shared experience, but the effect is always the same. When a person responds to every story with one of their own, when they interrupt to tell something better, or when they offer unsolicited advice, the implicit message is clear. My stuff matters more than yours. Even if said with a smile, this dynamic places the other person in the background. And no one feels respected when they perceive they're only serving as an audience. This behavior doesn't usually cause immediate rejection. On the contrary, many people remain polite, nod, even smile. But internally, something different happens. Attention fades. Interest wanes. The connection breaks without the need for confrontation. Subtle arrogance doesn't provoke visible conflicts, but it does cause silent absences. Furthermore, interrupting to correct, complete sentences, or demonstrate intellectual superiority conveys insecurity. Someone who truly trusts their worth doesn't need to assert themselves. They listen. They observe. Respect is born when someone feels seen and considered, not when they are overshadowed. Over time, people stop sharing ideas, emotions, or experiences with you, not because they don't trust you, but because they know they won't have the space. Conversation stops being an exchange and becomes a unilateral exhibition, and when that happens, respect inevitably weakens. This attitude is dangerous because it often goes unnoticed by the person exhibiting it. It's mistaken for confidence when in reality it pushes others away. And so, without realizing it, a person can end up surrounded by polite silences instead of genuine respect. There are people for whom nothing ever seems right. There's always something wrong, someone annoying, a situation that's unfair. Constant complaining isn't always expressed dramatically. Sometimes it's subtle, everyday, almost automatic, but its effect is profound. Every negative comment adds weight to the conversation and turns any encounter into an emotional burden. The problem isn't pointing out a real difficulty, but making complaining a habitual way of relating to the world. When everything is perceived through dissatisfaction, others begin to feel responsible for absorbing that negativity. Listening becomes exhausting. Without realizing it, people start to protect themselves by creating distance. In psychology, this is called emotional contagion. Negative emotions spread quickly and activate alert responses in the listener. The body reacts as if there's a constant threat. That's why, even if no one says it openly, people avoid those who complain constantly. It's not a lack of empathy. It's a need to preserve one's own balance. Over time, this attitude erodes respect. The person stops being seen as someone capable of facing reality clearly, and becomes associated with tension and weariness. Conversations shorten. Invitations decrease. Respect is lost without arguments, without reproaches, without explanations. Constant complaining doesn't build closeness, it destroys it. And when those around you start to silently withdraw, the message has already been sent. But there's still another attitude, very common and often misinterpreted, that also silently weakens respect. At first glance, being compliant can be interpreted as a positive quality. Always saying yes, avoiding conflict, adapting to the wishes of others. However, when this attitude becomes constant, it begins to erode respect. Not because being kind is a problem, but because the absence of boundaries sends a clear signal. One's own opinion doesn't matter. People who try to please all the time often apologize even when they've done nothing wrong. They give up their space, their time, and their needs just to avoid inconveniencing others. At first, this generates sympathy, but over time, something changes. Others stop seeing this person as someone with their own judgment and begin to perceive them as easily molded. Respect is born from internal coherence, from knowing what you want and what you don't. When someone never sets a boundary, they become predictable and, in a way, invisible. They're not consulted for their vision, but for their availability. They're not valued for their character, but for their usefulness. There's a deep difference between being kind and lacking self-esteem. Kindness arises from choice. People-pleasing stems from fear. Fear of rejection, of disapproval, of being alone. And that fear is perceived, even if not named. People respect those who respect themselves. Saying no doesn't push away those who matter. On the contrary, it establishes a clear framework where the relationship can be honest. When someone dares to be healthily uncomfortable, they show confidence. And confidence generates respect. Someone who never takes a stand eventually loses weight in the eyes of others, not out of malice, but because respect needs boundaries to exist. And when those boundaries aren't there, the bond becomes unbalanced. But this isn't the only way respect diminishes. There's another, even less obvious attitude that also weakens the perception of personal strength. Constantly blaming others is an attitude that silently but deeply weakens respect. When someone attributes all their problems to their boss, family, society, or bad luck, they convey a clear idea: they have no control over their own life. Some circumstances may be unfair, but when responsibility never falls on oneself, something breaks in external perception. People respect those who take their part, even in difficult situations. It's not about taking on unnecessary blame, but about recognizing one's own room for action. When someone systematically avoids that responsibility, they appear helpless, and helplessness rarely inspires respect. On the contrary, it creates distance. In psychology, this is referred to as an external locus of control. It's the belief that what happens always depends on external factors. This stance momentarily relieves pressure but comes at a social cost. Someone who lives from this perspective projects fragility. Others perceive a lack of internal solidity, that any difficulty will be passed on to someone else. Furthermore, blaming others often comes with constant justifications. Every mistake has an external explanation, every failure an outside culprit. Over time, these explanations stop being convincing. People listen, nod, but internally stop taking seriously someone who never takes charge. Respect is born when someone shows they can respond, not just react. Taking responsibility doesn't mean always being right, but showing maturity. And that maturity is perceived without the need for words. When someone stops blaming and starts taking charge, the way others look at them changes. But as long as responsibility remains external, respect will continue to silently drift away. And there's still another, less obvious attitude that also erodes the perception of personal worth. There are people who work hard, constantly strive, and yet feel undervalued. They believe that respect will come if they do more, endure more, sacrifice more. But invisible effort rarely generates respect, not because it doesn't exist, but because it's not perceived. And what is not seen holds no weight in the minds of others. Confusing humility with invisibility is a common mistake. Being discreet doesn't mean disappearing. When someone never expresses their boundaries, never shows their principles, and never makes clear what they contribute, others have no references to measure their value. It's not malice, it's perception. Respect is built on clear signals. Furthermore, silent effort can be interpreted as unlimited availability. If you're always there, if you never claim space or recognition, people assume they can count on you without consequences. Over time, this turns dedication into obligation, and obligation into something that is no longer appreciated. Respect is not born from constant sacrifice, but from visible integrity, from acting according to clear values and upholding them even when it's uncomfortable. Showing what matters, saying why it matters, and acting accordingly. It's not bragging, it's providing context. When someone starts to make their effort visible in a healthy way, their essence doesn't change, but external perception does. Others understand where the boundaries are, what can be asked, and what cannot, and that clarity generates respect. The problem with invisible effort is that it wears you down internally and builds nothing externally. And when a person feels exhausted and undervalued, respect has already dwindled. But there's still one last attitude, perhaps the most decisive of all, that determines whether respect is maintained or lost over time. There's one attitude that, more than any other, ultimately destroys respect over time: inconsistency. Saying one thing and doing another, promising and not delivering, defending certain values in words, but contradicting them with actions. It doesn't always happen, obviously. Sometimes they are small gestures, repeated decisions that don't align with what is said. People don't evaluate others by intentions, but by patterns. An isolated action can be forgiven, but repetition creates a clear image. When someone constantly changes their stance, when today they assert one thing and tomorrow act in an opposite way, it creates confusion. And where there is confusion, respect weakens. Inconsistency conveys unreliability. Others stop knowing what to expect. It's not about being perfect, but about being consistent. Even making mistakes can generate respect if there's honesty and continuity in principles. What destroys it is the feeling that words carry no weight. From a psychological point of view, consistency is a sign of stability. When someone keeps their behavior aligned with what they say, they inspire confidence. In contrast, inconsistency activates distrust. People start to protect themselves, not taking commitments or opinions seriously. The most dangerous thing about this attitude is that it rarely generates direct conflict. No one usually confronts the inconsistent person. They simply adjust their expectations. They trust less. They count on them less. They respect them less. And that change happens in silence. Respect functions like an invisible account. Every consistent act adds. Every contradiction subtracts. When the balance reaches zero, there's no discussion or prior warning. Just distance. That's why maintaining consistency is not a matter of image, but of personal credibility. We have reached the last attitude, but there is still something important. Understanding what to do with all this, and how to regain respect when it has already been lost. None of these attitudes define who you are. They are not fixed traits or permanent sentences. They are everyday habits, often unconscious, that are repeated until they build an image. And the important thing about habits is that they can be changed. Respect is not lost due to a single mistake, but due to patterns that are maintained over time. Losing respect isn't always accompanied by warnings. Rarely does anyone say it out loud. It's simply noticed in gestures, in distance, in the way people stop listening to you with the same attention. That's why becoming aware is the first step. Honestly seeing what attitudes have settled in without us realizing it. Respect is not asked for or demanded. It is built through consistency, responsibility, and clear boundaries. Listening more than you speak. Taking your own part without blaming. Showing judgment without imposing it. Saying no when necessary. Acting in accordance with what you say. These are simple gestures, but they accumulate. Changing these attitudes doesn't mean becoming rigid or distant. It means becoming more conscious, more present, more aligned with oneself. When that happens, external perception changes naturally. Not because you seek approval, but because you convey solidity. The final question is not whether you have ever lost respect. We all have at some point. The real question is another. What attitude are you willing to review today, so as not to continue losing it tomorrow?